The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision written by Chief Justice Earl Warren, ruled that the prosecution could not introduce Miranda's confession as evidence in a criminal trial because the police had failed to first inform Miranda of his right to an attorney and against self-incrimination. In a 7-2 decision written by Justice Harry Blackmun, the court ruled that the Texas statute violated Jane Roe's constitutional right to privacy. The court argued that the Constitution's First, Fourth, Ninth, and 14th Amendment protect an individual's zone of privacy against state laws and cited past cases, ruling that marriage, contraception, and child rearing are activities covered in this zone of privacy. The court voted in a 6-2 decision to affirm the Criminal Appeals Court decision to bring flag burning under the protection of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1989 in the case of Texas v. Johnson that the First Amendment rights of citizens to engage in free speech, even if that speech is offensive, outweighs the government's interest in protecting the American flag as a symbol of American unity and prevents the breach of the peace which was argued to be the result of such an action. In 2002, the Supreme Court banned the execution of mentally disabled inmates, but the 6-3 decision in Atkins v. Virginia essentially left it to the states to determine how to measure mental disability. In the landmark decision in Roper v. Simmons, issued on March 1, 2005, the United States Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that it is unconstitutional to impose the death penalty for a crime committed by a child under the age of 18. By a 7-2 majority, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Duncan, arguing that the right to a jury trial in criminal cases was fundamental and central to the American conception of justice. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that government involvement in this case creates a state-sponsored and state-directed religious exercise in a public school. Such conduct conflicts with settled rules prescribing prayer for students. The 1938 Supreme Court decision supported a federal gun control law and ruled that independent gun rights had to be connected to citizens' common obligation to serve in militias when called. The case opened door to more individualistic reading of Second Amendment, but offered no protection to guns that couldn't reasonably be used in militia service. This decision by the Supreme Court of the United States addressed the constitutionality of a search of a public high school student for contraband after she was caught smoking. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, held that the search was reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. The landmark case in which the Supreme Court of the United States held in a 5-4 decision that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution applies to federal enclaves and protects an individual's right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. In a 5-4 opinion delivered by Justice Clarence Thomas, the court held that because the policy reasonably serves the school district's important interest in detecting and preventing drug use among its students, it is constitutional. In a fiercely split decision, the court ruled 5-4 against the existence of reportorial privilege in the press clause of the First Amendment. The decision invalidating the use of the First Amendment as a defense for reporters summoned to testify before a grand jury. In 1963, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of Gideon, guaranteeing the right to legal counsel for criminal defendants in federal and state courts. Following the decision, Gideon was given another trial with an appointed lawyer and was acquitted of the charges. This case was the United States Supreme Court case that upheld the disciplinary corporal punishment policy of Florida's public schools by a 5-4 vote. In a ruling of 8-1, this case decided whether school-sponsored non-denominational prayer in public schools violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The ruling was found unconstitutional. The justice delivered the opinion of the 7-2 majority. The Supreme Court held that the armbands represented pure speech that is entirely separate from the actions or conduct of those participating in it. The court also held that the students did not lose their First Amendment rights to freedom of speech when they stepped onto school property. When the Duarte chapter of Rotary International violated club policy by admitting 3 women into its active membership, its charter was revoked and it was expelled. The California Court of Appeals, however, in reversing a lower court decision, found that Rotary International's action violated a California Civil Rights Act prohibiting sexual discrimination. The decision was 7-0. The court brushed aside the First Amendment issue and declared that, quote, all evidence obtained by searches and seizures in violation of the Constitution is, by the Fourth Amendment, inadmissible in a state court. The decision was 6 votes for MAP and 3 votes against. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, stated that the Supreme Court of Florida had violated the U.S. Constitution when it ordered the recount only in certain districts, and that the recount had already been tainted by shifting methods of vote counting. Both of these, it said, violated the equal protection guarantees of the 14th Amendment. By a 6-2 vote, Justice Kennedy took no part in the case, the court held that under the 4th Amendment no warrant was necessary to search the trash. This was a United States Supreme Court case holding that criminal suspects have a right to counsel during police interrogations under the 6th Amendment. The reasonableness of a search is judged by, quote, balancing the intrusion of the individual's Fourth Amendment interests against the promotion of legitimate governmental interests. In the case of high school athletes who are under state supervision during school hours, they are subject to greater control than over free adults. The decision was 6 votes for the school district and 3 votes against. The court ruled for the Times 9-0. The rule of law applied by the Alabama courts was found constitutionally deficient for failure to provide safeguards for freedom of speech and of the press as required by the First and 14th Amendment. This was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. In a 7-2 decision, the court held that the death penalty was a grossly disproportionate punishment for the crime of rape. The court noted that nearly all states at that time declined to impose such a harsh penalty, with Georgia being the only state that authorized death for the rape of an adult woman. This is a U.S. constitutional law case dealing with the regulation of campaign spending by organizations. The United States Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by a nonprofit corporation. In a unanimous decision, 9 votes for Loving and 0 votes against, the court held that distinctions drawn according to race were generally odious to free people and were subject to the most rigid scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. In Schenck v. United States, 1919, Supreme Court invented the famous clear and present danger test to determine when a state could constitutionally limit an individual's free speech rights under the First Amendment. This was a United States Supreme Court case in which the court held that the state juries may convict a defendant by less than unanimity, even though federal law required that federal juries must reach criminal verdicts unanimously. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision written by Chief Justice William Rehnquist and released in 1995, ruled that the Gun-Free School Zones Act was unconstitutional and overturned Lopez's conviction.